Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all, Canada's most irreverent talk show here on this Tuesday, June 4th, 2024. Great to have you aboard the program for another day of what I hope lives up to the irreverence you've all come to know and love. Not irrelevance, you got to be careful on the autocorrect there. We are going to be speaking a little bit later on in the show with Heidi McKillop, who is a filmmaker, I believe from Alberta, but she's got a new documentary coming out today. We are going for the breaking news here, and that documentary looks very critically at why so many of these green energy initiatives are not actually green or all that efficient on the energy question. So we'll talk to Heidi very shortly. Also coming up later on, our good friend Adam Zivo about the lengths to which the harm reduction activists will go to disrupt their critics and to intimidate their critics, of which Adam Zivo has very much cemented himself as one. That's coming up. He'll be on in, I think, 15 minutes or so. But I want to begin talking about this rather bombshell story that came yesterday through a group called NSICOP. Now, NSICOP is an acronym, and what is it? NCICOP or whatever. But anyway, they call it NSICOP. It's the National Security Committee of Parliamentarians. And what this committee had done starting, I think, last year was look into foreign interference in Canadian elections. Remember that? It was all the rage for about 5 minutes or so. Justin Trudeau appointed his old skiing buddy, David Johnston, to lead what was at first a probe, and then the commissioner eventually said, okay, let's just have an inquiry instead to get himself out of Dodge there. Well, the Parliamentary National Security Committee, which is, again, a committee dominated by Liberal parliamentarians, looked into this. So they found a few little bombshells here that are now in the NSICOP report. Now, one of the big ones that came out, and I think this is shocking for a number of reasons, more what is not in the report rather than what is in the report, is that some Canadian politicians are, to use the word of the report, wittingly, which means knowingly participating in foreign interference. Now, the revelation here is that, yes, China successfully interfered in Canadian politics. Big surprise, right? China wanted Han Dong to win the Liberal nomination in Don Valley North. China very much interfered in that, had a, quote, significant impact, unquote, in Han Dong becoming the candidate. Han Dong is now an independent member of parliament. The Liberals have kicked him out of the caucus. Han Dong was also doing an end run around Canadian diplomatic channels to talk to the Chinese, I can't remember if it was the embassy or the consulate, but to talk to Chinese agents in Canada about the two Michaels, which as a backbench member of parliament was not his job. But we go into the details here and wonder, okay, who is it in Canadian politics that is working for foreign governments? And, well, you look through the report and it doesn't tell you. It says, so yes, some parliamentarians, that would include MPs and senators, and you better believe I know one senator whose name for sure is going to be on that list. But all of these members of parliament are now supposedly working for foreign governments. China is named in the report extensively. India is. There's one country that is redacted. I have a couple of suspicions. I'm not entirely sure. I know Iran has certainly tried to have influence in the diaspora around the world. There are perhaps Turkey is one that as well some people have suspected, but I don't know what's under the redaction there, or the old black highlighter, to use the Onion joke about the CIA. But what I do know is that the report is telling us that we have definitely people in Canadian government that have been co-opted, and we as Canadians don't get to learn who those people are. If I were an opposition member of parliament, and again, I haven't seen question period today, I would love to be hammering the government on that. Release the names. What is it you're trying to hide? Release the names of who it is in parliament, regardless of party, that is apparently working for a foreign government, wittingly or semi-wittingly, to use the options provided. But these are not useful idiots. These are not people that are being co-opted because they're dumb. These are people that fully knew what they were doing when they were engaging with foreign governments. But let's take a look at Chrystia Freeland's feigned outrage on this at a press conference this morning.
We have potentially MPs still sitting in Parliament who this committee says wittingly participated with foreign governments to undermine our elections. Does that not undermine Canadian confidence in our in our parliament and in our elections?
I think Canadians recognize how lucky we are to be Canadian and how strong our democracy is. I think Canadians are smart and they recognize there is a very real threat. I think in the work of this committee, in the measures, the new and enhanced authorities our government has put in place, I think Canadians see that our government takes this threat seriously and is going to continue to act. And I do want to emphasize, I see this as not a partisan issue at all. I see this as an issue of the core national interest and the core strength of Canada's democracy. That is how our government is going to act.
Sorry, I was trying to get a sense of whether there was something resembling at all an answer there, and I wasn't getting it. So the question, hey, we have MPs who are wittingly collaborating with foreign governments who might be working against Canada. Well, I think that Canadians are proud of our democracy. Really? That's your takeaway from that? That Canadians are just proud and everything's working and the government's going to continue to act? Continue doing what? You haven't done anything up to this point. What are you going to continue doing? If you're continuing to do what you were doing before, Deputy Prime Minister, then we're going to have more of the problems that are already underway right now. Governments look, I'm a libertarian. I have a very narrow view of what governments should do. Governments at their core need to protect their citizens from foreign threats, which means at a bare minimum, it's not raising the asexual pride flag. It's not ensuring gender balance in the budget. It's not doing any of that. At a core, the government should be protecting Canada from threats. That is supposed to be its full and primary priority. So when you have other governments that are wanting to infiltrate Canada in whatever way, they are trying to interfere in our elections. I saw someone point out on Twitter yesterday, or X as it's called, it's a fair point. Can you even call it foreign interference when you have members of the Canadian government that are saying, no, come on in. Yeah, Xi Jinping, you want to rig a nomination? You want to help? You want to get a preferred Liberal candidate in? Yeah, come on. I mean, they're not even interfering at that point. You can't open the door and invite the guy with the balaclava over his head on the sidewalk into your house and then claim later that he broke and entered. It doesn't work that way. When you're inviting him in, you are the problem. You are the foreign interferer. You are the one that is crippling Canadian democracy. So this idea that Chrystia Freeland gets up there and every Canadian just feels, oh, well, we actually have trust in the democratic process and we have trust in the government. No, the government is the problem. The government is the one that let it get this way. And anytime we've gotten information about this, through the commissioner's report, through David Johnston's report, we've learned that CSIS raised concerns with the government. The concerns went to the high ranks of the Liberal government, including to the Prime Minister's office, and at every stage were disregarded. We're told, oh yeah, maybe we'll set up a briefing, and why don't you just send a memo and put it in that paper shredder over there? It's actually our inbox. We'll get to it in the future. Oh, what do you know? We missed the memo. We don't know what you want of us here. So this is, to me, a baffling conundrum in the sense that the government is trying to convince us that it has the solution when China has seen Canada as having rolled out the red carpet for their operatives to influence our elections, China being the biggest culprit of this. And we're supposed to believe that the Liberal government, that the Chinese government, that the Chinese regime has wanted to invest in is going to be our way out of this. They're going to be the ones that save Canadian democracy. Do you feel all that confident about it? Now, Chrystia Freeland, we had a silly story at True North this week about how she was going door knocking talking about affordability, wearing designer sneakers that were $740. Now, I used to get, my shoes from, the discount rack at Winners or whatever, because, basically it doesn't even matter what size it is. Just if the price is right, just squeeze into the size 7 or deal with the floppy size 15 clown shoes. But Chrystia Freeland, she's all sorted out. She understands what Canadians are thinking because she's wearing the big designer sneakers when she's going knocking on doors. Is it a cheap shot? Maybe. But perhaps she should spend less time shopping for designer shoes and more time reading the report, reading the dire lengths that the dire straits, basically, of the Canadian ability to protect against foreign interference that her government has allowed to happen. There's the old line that's been said time and time again. Government is not the solution. Government is the problem. On foreign interference, it's not even the Chinese government that is the problem. It's not even the Chinese government that we are looking at to blame. We need to start with the first and primary agents and instigators here, which are Canadian parliamentarians that are apparently all too willing to cede Canadian sovereignty to foreign powers which are evidently quite hostile from to Canada's interests. So let's just break this down in a little bit more detail here, because when you read some of what's come out in the report, I actually believe this is a more conservative report. I believe this is a more conservative report because this is, again, it's been approved and signed off on by parliamentarians that overwhelmingly are themselves liberals. So let's just deal with the fact that what's not being said is probably far worse than what is being said. There's probably a lot more to this that we are likely to see come out in the future. But the government right now has had no curiosity, no desire to really get to the bottom of this. Remember, they didn't even want to have a full independent inquiry into this. They wanted to have Justin Trudeau's preferred guy, David Johnston, do this. And what is quite frankly shocking about this is how little Canadians seem to care. And I'm not admonishing people. I realize people have big problems in their lives when you can't afford a house, you can't afford groceries, you can't afford gas. I get all of that. But ultimately, democracy, well, it feels and seems to many people like an abstract concept, is actually anything but abstract. Because if the democratic process is not intact, nothing that happens in government is going to solve your problems. Nothing that happens in government is going to work for you when other governments have their fingers in the pot of the democratic process, when they're choosing nomination candidates and they're doing all of this other stuff. So we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in the future. I wanted to just briefly mention this bizarre announcement from the immigration minister, Mark Miller. So it was really weird. A few weeks ago, it looked like the Liberals were starting to realize the problems of the immigration system in Canada, that, as Justin Trudeau said, we took in more than we could absorb in a short period of time, that we had too many temporary residents, more than Canadian housing could accommodate, Canadian job markets could accommodate. And everything that the government has done since then has completely shown they actually were not having a moment of lucidity at all. Because at one point we heard that the government is entertaining turning illegal immigrants into permanent residents, giving them a path to citizenship. And now we have a new announcement from the minister this morning, which is quite surprising here, that if you are brought into Canada as a caregiver, you're basically going to have permanent residency upon arrival, and the language requirements, language being, quite important to function in a country, are going to be softened as well. Take a look.
I'm very pleased to announce that we are launching new pilots that will provide permanent residency status for caregivers as soon as they arrive in Canada. The biggest change coming in these new pilots will be providing a one-step immigration process. Before, caregivers first needed to get work permits and then obtain work experience before applying for permanent residency. Under the new rules, we're simplifying the process and providing them with a clear, straightforward pathway to stay and care for our loved ones. The change will notably provide more autonomy for caregivers to leave workplaces with abusive situations and seek opportunities to advance in the care sector. And Lord knows I've heard a lot of those stories, not only today, but in the past, as we've been listening and reaching out to people that have been providing that support and have been in abusive situations. I'm also pleased to share that we are lowering, out of fairness, the language requirements to Canada Language Benchmark 4 under these new PR on arrival pilots. Our aim is to strike a balance between breaking down the barriers caregivers face to get PR and selecting newcomers who will be resilient to changes in the labor market. Lowering the language requirements is a must-needed change that we've heard directly from the community on, and will align with other programs in my department, as well as provincial programs, creating better consistency and fairness for all applicants. Caregivers will still have the needed language skills to work in the caregiving field. Let me be clear about that. And finally, as we look to address the desperate need for caregivers, we're also expanding the pilot programs from private household employers now to also include organizations who will directly employ home care workers. This will allow for and not-for-profit organizations to provide jobs, job offers, and help address home care needs where labor shortages exist.
I like the one person that clapped at the beginning when he made the announcement. So I was like, yeah, you go, Mark. That was like his press secretary, presumably on the side. It was a major Jeb Bush, please clap vibes, if you remember that from, I think, the 2016 Republican primary. But again, he's saying, all right, on one hand, the language requirements, they have to have the language they need to be caregivers, but no more than that. And we're going to give them permanent residency immediately. Now, the government is, again, for a government that claims it understands the immigration crunch, not making any decisions or taking any courses of action that suggest they genuinely understand that problem. So now someone comes in as a caregiver, they're a permanent resident immediately. I haven't looked at the nitty gritty yet, but it strikes me that if they decide they no longer want to be a caregiver after a short period of time, they're already in the country anyway. So we've now found a way to fast track entry into Canada for people that don't necessarily have a solid grasp of the English language and people that up until a minute ago wouldn't have been eligible for permanent residency as quickly. So this is not a government that is definitely showing itself to be at all a credible voice on these issues. And I think it's an opening to have a sensible, grown-up discussion about immigration in Canada, as I talked about with Aaron Woodrick, who was on the show yesterday. But we had this conversation a few months back or so. But let's turn our attention to the wonderful world of harm reduction. Now, this has been a space where, a lot like COVID, on one hand, you get people that say, trust the science, and then you look into what the so-called science is, and the science doesn't actually support what a lot of the activists say it does. I mean, funny timing on this. Anthony Fauci this week admitted under oath that he just kind of made up the social distancing stuff and he made up the masking stuff and didn't really have any science behind it. But in the harm reduction space as well, you have all of these activists, very, very heated, passionate activists that talk about what they're doing as though it is science, but they have, in fact, a religious fervor about it. Now, we've talked about this with Adam Zivo from the National Post, who has delved into this issue more than any other journalist in Canada has. And what I found quite surprising, and he was reporting on this last week, was the extent to which some of these activists that he's covered were trying to disrupt a conference of their critics. Now, ideally, in a sensible grown-up world, you engage with your critics. You debate them. You say, well, actually, I think you're wrong, and here's why. And that's what people like Adam Zivo have tried to do, and people like Sharon Koivu and Julian Summers, both of whom we've had on the show. But these activists had a little secret meeting that Adam got his hands on, where they talked about dyeing a hotel conference fountain red. They talked about spraying people with a fire extinguisher filled with paint. Might have been a bit of a joke, but I'm not sure it's exactly ha-ha funny. They talked about intimidating, tracking, and monitoring all of these people. Sounds a little bit McCarthy-esque. So why are they not just engaging in the debate if they're confident the facts are on their side? Adam Zivo returns to the show. It's always good to talk to him. Adam, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me back on the show.
We have like a yin-yang effect going on right now. You're in the darkness and I'm in the light. So hopefully you'll be your words themselves will be illuminating here. But let me start on that point, because these people do claim that the science is on their side, but they don't want to debate the facts, it seems.
Just a quick note, I am in Ukraine and there is a blackout right now, so I do apologize in advance if I cut out. I'm actually tethering to my phone data.
It's remarkably good connection for a war zone, so I'm glad you're making the time so late in the night.
Sorry. And the last question, was it about the science on the side?
Well, the activists think that the science is on their side, but don't seem to want to debate the science. They don't want to engage in it. They'd rather, as you learned, dye a fountain red to make their point.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing: is that there are all sorts of important policy debates to be had about addiction policy, and harm reduction is not inherently a bad thing. It's considered one of the four main pillars of an effective addiction strategy, with the other pillars being treatment, enforcement, and prevention. So many people who criticize harm reduction are not against all forms of harm reduction. They just want a more thoughtful approach to it. But for many radical harm reduction activists, that's unacceptable. They treat the most radical forms of harm reduction as sacrosanct truths that cannot be questioned or discussed, even though many of these interventions have only come about within the last 10 years and have very flimsy evidence bases. And so I think it's a sign of
There's that cutout that he warned us about a few moments ago. We'll try to get Adam Zivo back on the show here. But I think the point is an incredibly valid one. And if you look at the context behind this, I mean, I have had a number of times where I have reached out to people on a particular side of an issue, not just this issue, but other ones as well. And they don't respond. They say they don't want to talk to you. They come up with all these sorts of excuses of, oh, well, I don't think it's going to be a good faith interview, a good faith this or that. And I've never had anyone, by the way, ever accuse me of doing anything that was unfair as far as interviewing is concerned. So I go back to the details here. And if you read Adam's piece in the National Post about this, and you follow him on social media, he shared the audio recordings of this Zoom meeting they had, this Zoom meeting where all of these people planned on how they would disrupt this conference, which was called the Prosper Symposium. It was hosted by the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions. And again, the people in this are scientists. The people in this are Dr. Keith Humphreys, Dr. Julian Summers, again, we've had on the show, psychologists. So these people are coming up with science-based solutions to these problems. And I don't know, I wasn't an organizer of this conference, but I suspect they would have welcomed the opportunity to have one of these harm reduction activists on the stage and say, let's actually talk about our different approaches here. We have Adam Zivo back, so feel free to pick up where you left off there, Adam. I think we have him back. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, just carry on where you left off there.
Right. Yeah, so you had mentioned earlier, so there was this Prosper conference, and this conference was put together by a number of very distinguished experts in the addiction medicine world. You had a number of well-respected doctors who are addiction medicine practitioners who have been critical of radical harm reduction and have argued for a more balanced approach. You had, as mentioned before, Keith Humphreys, who is a Stanford professor who has been a leading figure in the development of American and British drug policy. You have Kevin Sabet, who was a former White House policy advisor for both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, making him one of the rare examples of a bipartisan policy expert in this space. So this was not some gathering of wackos, right? These were people who knew their stuff and want to present an alternative, recovery-oriented perspective on the addiction crisis in Canada. Now, when this conference was announced, harm reduction activists across Canada, but predominantly in BC, decided that this was unacceptable. So they came together and they organized and tried to find ways to discredit the attendees of this conference, to disrupt the conference and potentially shut it down. And so on May 21st and May 28th, they had two large Zoom meetings, which included a total of about 20 people and 20 organizations, where they plotted how they could do this. And some of the tactics that they described went beyond normal protest and got into the realm of intimidation. So they talked about sending activists into this conference so they could shout down speakers, secretly record attendees. They talked about dyeing a fountain red to symbolize blood. They debated whether or not that was legal or constituted property damage. They explored the possibility of parking a car right beside the building and honking their horn, which of course is a tactic that we saw back in 2020 with the trucker convoy. And once again, I do really want to stress that people have a right to protest, but this went beyond that. And I managed to get a recording of these two meetings. And once I reviewed it, I realized that we had a problem here, and that there wasn't, these activists were not interested in allowing a space for reasonable debate about addiction policy. They were interested in shutting down and silencing their opponents.
Yeah, and one thing I found quite interesting, there was actually a lamentation of sorts of, if I can find it here, where they basically said, I don't think we have, unfortunately, a chance to kind of really shut it down, unquote. So their first instinct was, can we just avoid this from make this not happen altogether? You're either stunned into silence or frozen. I think the connection is not cooperating today. We'll get Adam back on the show in the future, but I do hope he's able to join us when the connection is stabilized. He has done a tremendous reporting on Ukraine, and as you've seen there, he gives up the comfort of a reliable internet connection and power to do his journalism. So he's in the midst of a blackout now, but I appreciate very much him coming on there. I wanted to turn to this event that's happening in Calgary today. It's the premiere of a new documentary called Generation Green. Now, if you can make it to the documentary, it is at the Plaza Theatre in Northwest Calgary tonight at 6 o'clock Mountain Time. But I think the documentary itself is one that people across the country should be paying attention to as well, because we hear all the time from the activists, the government, many people in the media, the importance of having green energy initiatives. We need to subsidize this, subsidize that, and all the like. But the one thing that people often forget to consider is that a lot of this is not at all based on the science. Just like with harm reduction, just like with COVID, what people present as scientific solutions oftentimes are anything but. So as we delve into this, I was glad to see this film come to the forefront here. It's called Generation Green. The filmmaker is Heidi McKillop, who joins us on the line now. Heidi, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Now, I just saw you a couple of days ago at my book launch in Calgary, so thanks again very much for coming out to that. So what's the story you're telling here?
So basically what we wanted to dive into was this question of what are the pros and cons of renewables? You know, I really was personally confused when I started to read articles online and everything was like 100% renewables, they're performing at this. And I'm like, well, if they're performing that high, then why are we still backing up everything with coal, hydro, natural gas, oil, you name it? Every country is pivoting because the energy demand is so high. So obviously there was a discrepancy there that we really wanted to dive into. So that was part of our investigation.
And what did you find? Not to give away too much, but what did you come away with?
So there's a couple key points that we really wanted to address in the film. The first component of the film is really speaking about, you know, solar panels on your roof. You have a direct connection to that energy source. It doesn't have to go into transmission lines that lose energy. So essentially those forms of solar panels are actually not too bad for an average household. You can debate if you want to, you know, put the investment into it or not. But right now with our current federal government, they're heavily subsidized. So we kind of left that into the pro. The con really is, though, is that the renewable energy movement has basically gone off of numbers of their installed capacity instead of their actual output of what they're performing at. So we address this and we try to make it as simplistic as we can for our audience that doesn't really have an energy background or doesn't have an engineering background. Another component to this, which is extremely important to me as a new mom, as you know, a woman in this space, is really the exploitation of children in Africa for mining extractions that is used for the renewable energy movement, specifically cobalt. We were investigating in the Congo, and obviously there's a lot of problems that have been affiliated with cobalt extraction, primarily because they are completely owned in a majority from Chinese-owned companies. This is a huge conversation that we have to take into the supply chain, is that if you are going to demand an energy source and displace those emissions globally, is that fair? Is that really the way that we want to conduct ourselves as Canadians?
Yeah, and it's an interesting question. I remember when I was covering the World Economic Forum's meeting in Davos, I can't remember if it was this year or it might have been last year, there was this one mining executive that's getting up there and saying, oh yeah, we need to do battery everything, battery powered everything, fossil fuels are a thing of the past. And then you look at his mining operation and realize that his company is doing all the mining that we need if we're converting to battery everything. So it's not this altruistic environmental message. And people often forget that there's a cost to everything. And it's not the case that you can get rid of this one energy source and have another one. We haven't yet harnessed wind in a meaningful way, which is the only form of energy that I guess doesn't really have a consequence apart from the construction of the windmills. But you're right, all of these other ones do, and they're either ineffective or partially effective or incredibly intensive to produce, as in the case of mining.
Yes, exactly. And even with the wind turbines, what is really interesting, we've gone off, dove into this very intensively in the documentary as well, because we had the opportunity to go down to southern Alberta and talk to landowners about the placement of the wind turbines, specifically this one project that recently got canceled. But it was due in part because of the mobilization of community members in southern Alberta. And they were really trying to say, like, this is a pristine area of Alberta, right by the adjacent to the Waterton Park. They don't want to see that land industrialized by any kind of energy company. And they certainly have a right to start asking these types of conversations. This is a really complex issue. We can't just pick and choose which conversation we want to say is the truth or not. It really needs to be foundationally built around a larger conversation. And I'm not personally against wind or solar. I think any kind of technology that we want to diversify in within means is a great idea, but you're going to have the same regulations that the oil and gas faces, which is proper decommissioning of the wind turbines, proper disposal sites for solar panels, which we do not have in place right now. And under my understanding is that that really does need to be improved long term.
Yeah, and you're right to point out, and I'm glad you shared your own perspective on this, because I think there's a knee-jerk reactionary component that even some supporters of the oil and gas sector have. Whereas if they hear green energy, they assume it's bad because it's coming from people that typically hate oil and gas. And I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. But ideally, we should be approaching any energy discussion with the same conversation, which is this efficient? Is this affordable? What does it do for our stated goals, our needs for energy production, our stated environmental goals, all of that? And you should be able to have that discussion in a fairly dispassionate way that is focused on the facts. But all of a sudden you have people that are just against oil and gas, and they don't actually care about hearing things that the oil and gas industry is doing in Canada and the United States to some extent to deal with the problems that they raise. And this is where we end up where there is a need for this grown-up conversation about it.
When we started to put out documentaries like this, I get quite a bit of backlash on my personal life. And, people will start saying, you have a sociology background, a social work background, or, who are you? You were a receptionist at one point and a waitress. I'm like, yeah, that's exactly it. I'm really proud of the transition of being able to be in different faceted industries. And that collectively, hopefully, will be projected in my films, basically of having a balanced conversation from a human perspective. We really focused a lot on the citizens. We focused on the people in the regions of what their voices and concerns were. And that's what I care about, is that we have to have that open dialogue from the ground up, not from the top down. And I think that's something that I'm really proud about with this film that we accomplished, is really getting the citizens to be at the forefront of the discussion.
So you've been in this space for quite a while, and I know you've had an open mind about this. Did anything surprise you? Did you learn much when you were making this?
A lot. Yeah, I think there's a couple things that really shocked me. Was definitely the numbers. I feel very disheartened by the fact that certain groups are putting out random numbers that are so contradictory to what their actual performance is at in terms of industrial wind and solar plants. That really confuses me. And, if I'm confused working in this energy space for quite a few years, I can guarantee you my mom, my grandmother, my sister, they're all going to be confused as well. So I think that's really something that I was shocked by and didn't appreciate.
Who's your target on this? Because the challenge when you have these sorts of discussions a lot of the time is that the people that are going to come out and see it are the ones that are already on your side, or already open to it. There's a tremendous hostility in certain subsets. I mean, even in Alberta, it's probably the most feisty, the opposition in Alberta. But so how do you break through that? How do you get it to the people that genuinely need to see this message?
That's a great question, Andrew. And I think that with each film that we start to do, it slowly progresses into getting more viewership. And hopefully over time, people will start taking me more seriously as a director and producer of film. And I do get a lot of backlash because I don't have primarily a film background. I fell into it when I was at my waitressing job and just started to hear people talk about their problems and about the narratives around oil and gas. And I thought, gosh, like what a great documentary this would make. And that was my first one, A Stranded Nation. So since then, over the last 5 years, it's really progressed. And I try to challenge myself in my own beliefs every time we tackle a subject. I sit down, I I play both pros and cons. I weigh them very heavily in my head, and I do a ton of research. So I hope over time people will slowly start getting into the idea that even if you disagree with a topic, or even me as a person, that you will take the time to actually watch something that maybe will challenge your point of view.
All right. Well, where can people get details about the event tonight?
So it's on Eventbrite, and the film begins around 6 o'clock and doors open at 5. It's at the Calgary Plaza in Kensington. We hope to see you folks there. And then tomorrow we'll be launching it digitally online on my YouTube channel.
All right. The film is called Generation Green. Definitely give it a look. Heidi McKillop, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
All right, that does it for us for today. We'll be back tomorrow with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show. Now, I'm actually going to be in Ottawa tomorrow hosting a book event where we will hopefully have, we're going to have a lot of people out there. So thanks to those of you who are coming out. We have a special edition of the Andrew Lawton Show planned in the interim as I'll be on the road. But I do hope you have a great day. We will talk to you tomorrow. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.